Are you an independent thinker or are you more of a conformist? We might like to think of ourselves as open-minded, critical thinkers, but there are a lot of psychological and social factors that can lead us to groupthink. So, how susceptible are we to groupthink, and how can we break out or see through groupthink, especially in our workplaces? Ryan Smerek is an associate professor at Northwestern University and the author of Speaking Up at Work, Leading Change as an Independent Thinker. And he joins me now. Good morning, Ryan.
Good morning. Nice to see you.
Thanks for joining us. So,
Mhm.
your book starts off by introducing the reader to this psychological experiment done in the 1950s, I think, that really looks into this. So, tell us about the Solomon Asch experiment and what it told us about our predisposition to conforming.
Sure. Yeah. The Solomon Asch experiment. It was a fairly famous experiment in the 1950s where you're in a room with 10 other individuals. Unbeknownst to you, they're actors, and there's two cards put up. One card that's the length of a line that's say clearly 6 inches long, and then there's three other lines, A, B, and C. One is also 6 inches, and the other are clearly different. They're clearly different, maybe 12 inches and 3 inches. And you have to say which one A, B, and C is the same as the other card. But you're last in the line, and then everybody else says a wrong answer. They say it's the 3 inch line, and you're sort of at the end. You don't know everybody's actors, so you're kind of befuddled and questioning your senses. And the question is whether you see what you plainly see, black and white, in front of you, or do you go along with the group and conform? And this gives a very clear black and white answer. I mean, you have a black and white criterion for success. Unfortunately, some people do stay independent, but it's only about 25% on sort of the 12 critical trials actually say what they see in front of them. And that's it's wonderful that 25%, around 25% say what they clearly see, but it's also, worrisome, and we can, and it's a very black and white thing, and compared to a lot of disagreements or things we might experience in life that are ambiguous and uncertain and unclear. And so it at least gives us a baseline of that sort of conformity groupthink.
So only 25% of people in that experiment said what they believed or knew to be true and were not influenced by those other actors giving an purposely incorrect statement in
Yeah,
all 12 of those trials.
25%, yeah, stayed independent over all the
Okay.
trials. They kept saying like, "Oh, it's clearly A, it's clearly B, it's clearly no." So
So let's use that example as a starting off point then to talk about like two things I want to talk about here, groupthink and independent thinking. So let's start with groupthink. What is the definition of groupthink?
yeah, the groupthink, it's a term coined by Irving Janis. He had a book in the 1970s that looked at a lot of foreign policy disasters in the U.S. and was kind of puzzled by how a very smart, the best and the brightest, could come to these disastrous decisions. Um, and he used the term groupthink, kind of this striving for unanimity and conformity. Let's all go along. Are we all in this together? And the sort of lack of critical dialogue about, is this the right move for us? He was, one of his most famous example was in the Kennedy administration and the Bay of Pigs disaster in the 1960s. Um, the term groupthink was meant to have this kind of invidious connotation, similar to this Orwellian term of doublespeak, where slavery is freedom, et cetera. These sort of, and he coined the term to be similar to that, this kind of groupthink where there isn't kind of this critical dialogue about what's going on. There's that desire um, for going along with the group and not speaking up, especially when there's a leader with a clear point of view.
So let's talk about that desire for going along with the group. And I think all of us hope that in that Solomon Asch experiment, we would be part of that 25% who consistently said what we thought, right, out loud, when everyone else was saying something different. So what are the kind of, let's start with the kind of internal psychological, what's going on in our brain that kind of induces us or encourages us to want to conform?
Yeah, it's really challenging. There is several neuroscience studies that sort of pain of sense of ostracism that even compares a sort of sense of ostracism to physical pain, that it's that painful to be kind of cast out. That fear of being cast out of the group is just very painful to consider or to experience. So that is one. Other times, it may be the case that we don't actually perceive a difference. I mean, there's other more modern day versions of the Solomon Asch experiment where people are in fMRI studies. And so in that case, there's a similar thing. There's like a puzzle with an objective standard, and you can see when you're in the fMRI machine, you can see what a group of people also said. And again, those are Confederates examples. So you can either say like, no, this puzzle should be this, that group is wrong. I'm going to say something differently or not. And the question is whether you even, in an fMRI study, do you perceive the world the same way as others, or do you actually perceive the world differently and then decide I'm going to go against that and say what I plainly see to be true? And so there's two questions there. A is, do you actually perceive a difference? And if you do perceive a difference, do you speak up? And unfortunately, there's a lot of times you don't actually perceive a difference. You just kind of go along. It's sort of the efficiency principle of the brain that I mentioned in the book, where you just it's difficult. Thinking through every issue takes a lot of time.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So you kind of go along. Yeah.
What is the efficiency principle of the brain?
Well, it's a more neutral term. In social psychology, there's a lot of discussion about we're kind of cognitive misers, or we can be miserly in our effort to think through things. Not always. We sort of fall on a continuum there, but we tend to, it can be, thinking through every issue and having a clear point of view does take time and cognitive effort. And there is a sort of the efficiency principle, sort of, we do try to preserve our mental energy for things. So we're not always kind of coming to our own independent point of view on every issue. And so that does lead to a lot of conformity, just because we haven't come with our own independent point of view on stuff. So
psychologically, because our brain is trying to preserve its energy or resources, doesn't feel like it needs to think through every single issue, and to preserve those energy and resources.
Yeah.
Will not think through everything.
Correct. Yeah. And that'll lead to a lot of well, I guess I haven't studied this. I don't know a lot about this. It looks like everybody else around me is really certain about this. So that seems fine. I'll go along. So that happens a lot. That happens a lot, obviously.
What's a socialized mind in this context?
Socialized mind is it's a term from human development and how we move through different stages in our life. And the socialized mind is this one stage where we generally move to a self-authoring mind, where we have an independent point of view and an internal sea of judgment. And a socialized mind is one stage of that, usually considered with sort of being a good team player, a good soldier, listening to orders, obeying authority. And it's usually consumed, your whole meaning system is kind of consumed with meeting those expectations of an authority figure, rather than moving to that self-authoring, when you start to have an independency of judgment. What do I really think about this? Do I think it's the right thing? And so it's from work from Robert Keegan at Harvard, his work on the socialized mind to the self-authoring mind.
You mentioned at the beginning kind of like the the fear of the pain of ostracization from the
Hmm.
group, right?
Hmm.
Talk to me a little bit about that and the kind of external factors that may push us to conform that we should be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of external factors. I mean, just the um, in addition to uh, wanting that desire for belongingness is really important for so many of us. It feels good to be part of a group. It's painful to be the one person that's a kind of a lone voice that's kind of shouting in the wind, as some people mentioned in interviews. So there are so many social factors there. Especially with our whole if our identity is mixed in with being part of the group. Uh, in the context I was looking at is in a work context. Of course, there's another added factor that your paycheck is part of that. So it's like it's very hard. There's a famous quote that it's difficult for a man to rethink his belief when his salary depends on it. So it's very, that's very hard too. That's another factor there that plays a huge role in it. Um, so yeah, there's so many kind of those external factors that influence our thinking and desire for unanimity.
When, the Solomon Asch trials were done, what did we learn about kind of personality traits, I guess, of those who participated that did tend to conform, even though I assumed they believed a certain thing, but didn't actually express what they really believed?
Yeah, I mean, he found, he mentioned, the people that did share what they saw to be true. They had a relatively higher sense of, he used the word self-worth. More currently, we would probably use word self-esteem.
The ones who were
Um,
independent thinkers and said
that
what
were
they believed.
independent thinkers. So you could say the reverse. Like if you're again the more socialized mind, a higher need for affiliation would be another one. Um, I looked at a lot of the inverse, what led people to speak up, but you could see each one of those would be kind of the inverse.
Mm.
If you're willing to be uh, uh, the critical thinking or lack of critical thinking, like do you have expertise or not expertise, the self worth, or maybe a lower self worth or self esteem to kind of say to be able to go against the group. Um, those would be a lot, and then similar to the socialized mind, if you're that was one of the things in the Solomon Asch study. The some people that even when they got one wrong, it was like maybe they got 1 out of 12. Um, they went with the group all the time, but they didn't one time, and they said, "Well, I was really trying to. I wanted to do what the experimenters wanted me to do. I messed it. I didn't want to mess it up for them. It's all consumed with conforming to the expectations of an authority figure in some way, like and rather than some sort of independent norms or sense of judgment."
So let's move now then to the qualities and the motivations for these independent thinkers. And you list a whole range in your book. We don't have time to talk about all of them, but there were a couple that I really did want to talk about in this conversation. So one of the qualities of an independent thinker you identify is people who place a high value on reason and truth. Tell us more about that quality, because this is all based on like conversations and interviews that you did,
Mm-hmm.
for this book. So what did you hear from those people?
Yeah, I mean, this is one that you can see in whistleblowers to a certain extent, and in writing about this, it was truth is kind of a battered term, but there is some sort of intuitive sense of whether something is a lie or a cover up or fraud, and so there is a motivation there. Some people have it as a slightly higher value, and that was one interview I did with a whistleblower where he spoke up about research malfeasance and potential research fraud in a research lab he was in. And for him, it was like the value of truth was his highest value, he mentioned. And as opposed to getting along um, or not rocking the boat. And, even with his group of other graduate students, it was like, well, what are we going to do? We don't want to say anything because it's what's going to happen with our research publications, or we're not going to get into, or, we could lose our job here. But for him, it was like truth, reason. Usually that's embedded in a scientific mindset to a certain degree, like what is true, what's being accurate, getting your facts straight. Um, and that, that can conflict with the kind of social motives and getting along as well. So that, is key in a scientific mindset. And it's similar among research reporters, that sort of value of reason and truth and getting the facts straight, what actually happened. Um, and some people that varies. It's a really important value, um, and for others it can be lower down the list. So
You also talk about the idea that many of these independent thinkers are kind of like outsiders.
uh,
Tell me more about that.
sure. I mean, it's one thing that helps you see, because you're not kind of striving for that group membership and group approval, that if you're slightly outsider. That was one of the things that um, if you're slightly on the periphery of a group or an outsider, you don't have that same desire to be either, whether it's just infused with seeing the world as everyone else sees it, or you don't have that social pull and desire for social approval. So um, the one example I discuss is think about Michael Burry. He was Big Short fame, Michael Lewis's book of he was one he in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, he was able to see in 2007 that coming, and made these $100 million bets against these Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs's, and was able to kind of see that as an independent thinker, kind of see the um, the huge kind of housing bubble and the risk that these firms were taking. He was an outsider to the group. He was kind of an outsider. He was just an independent investor. But there's loads of stories, similar to other sometimes famous whistleblowers, whether it's Sharon Watkins at Enron. You're maybe not part of the boys club in the group. She was like a woman, female executive at Enron. You're not part of the in group, so to speak. You're a bit of an outsider, and you're not, desiring and craving that kind of social approval, which can help you see things differently and take a different stance.
And there's another quality I wanted you to talk about, which I think is really important, especially in the workplace, is having the vulnerability of looking stupid and asking questions. Tell me about that one.
Yeah, it's a tough one. That was both in Sharon Watkins, her story at Enron, the whistleblower, and other interviews where people mentioned kind of questioning some sort of settled fact or settled wisdom, or just being able to say, like, this doesn't make sense to me, and then you can be kind of paternalistically scolded, kind of like, well, don't you get it? Everybody else, we've been doing it this way. Don't you see? And so it's tough. I mean, that was one interview I did with a participant that kind of mentioned, questioning forced ranking systems and organizations, and sort of that's, forcing everybody along a bell curve. And so some people are going to come out low performers no matter what, because you're kind of forced ranking. And him kind of questioning that, and, being kind of scolded in front of everybody that, well, don't you get it? All the top organizations do this. Or in the case of Sharon Watkins and Enron, also kind of be like, don't you get it? This is perfectly fine. You shouldn't be asking questions. So yeah, there's that vulnerability of looking stupid that, especially if you speak up in a public context, a meeting, and, you'll kind of be, maybe put in your place, so to speak, and it could be true that you don't, it's not always, it could be true that you don't understand some sort of something and maybe you learn about that. But in another context, it's kind of a smokescreen in a way.
You also talk about the pain of independence. Like what's happening to our amygdala when these independent thinkers speak up? Because there is an actually like a neurological cost.
Yeah, that was in fMRI, the more recent Solomon Asch studies, the fMRI studies that, if you saw the group had one judgment and you were going to go against it, there was that kind of pain of independence that typically in the amygdala region area. So it does evoke that neurological response of pain to be kind of ostracized or not going along with what everybody thinks.
And so I want to turn to now kind of how we see through groupthink or break out of groupthink. And you have a really interesting example in your book when a group of journalists did this after 9/11 and during the invasion of Iraq. Tell me about that example.
Sure. Yeah, it was another inspiring example. That was two journalists at Knight Ridder in DC, and it's a smaller publication. It's not the big name. It's not Washington Post, New York Times, but they were really kind of diving in and questioning the rationale of the lead up into the 2003 invasion of Iraq. They're kind of like, it doesn't make sense really that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. They sort of dove into the evidence. It was really tough. They kind of thought they were out on a loop there. They had different sources too. They weren't high-ranking official. They were sort of mid-level officials that were saying, "Yeah, this doesn't add up. The sources here are not very credible. They have a particular point of view and axe to grind here." And so they were publishing things, and they were, it was, again, that was on a sort of a national stage, post 9/11 in the U.S. This kind of where it would almost be unpatriotic to sort of go against the administration or kind of speak up. And the thing they had going for them too, and this is in psychology studies too, is that there was a pair of two of them, or you at least have one ally. It's like not completely yourself. Like if you have one other person, or two other people, it makes it more bearable. And so that's, again, it's psychology studies and for them too. So that was, they eventually, ended up getting all these awards for their skeptical reporting. And other famous outlets had to kind of apologize for their lack of skepticism about the evidence that was being presented by the senior administration officials there. So,
and they did their own research, right? Like they went and read all these UN reports and kind of came to that conclusion based on their own research of what was very readily available to everyone if they wanted to actually take the time to do that.
Yeah, it wasn't just being contrarian, like, oh, it's like, oh, and being like critical and being contrarian without any evidence or doing their homework. And they mentioned that too, like, oh, we sort of thought and believed them as well until we dove in. And after a month of kind of diving into the evidence, we're like, well, this doesn't make any sense. There's no actual evidence of this. There's no reason why this would be the case. Yeah, it's not just like, there's sort of the critique, like a broken clock is right twice a day. You have enough people out there saying an independent point of view or a counter point of view. Some of those people are going to be right, but not in this case too, that they were looking at the evidence as well and saying, using their own critical faculties and saying like, it doesn't make sense. And they, did prove to be right. So.
And that example is a good one because you mentioned like, after 9/11, it was kind of unpatriotic to question. Mm-hmm. Like there was like this really heightened emotional backdrop to that. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of my next question when, you can think of any kind of like huge challenge facing society, whether it was 9/11 or COVID, or even like an emotionally polarized time now with the elections coming up. You're in the States, mm-hmm. You know that very well. When things are so polarized and are so emotionally charged, how does that impact our ability to think independently? Is groupthink even more prevalent during those moments of heightened
It is,
emotions?
yeah. Yeah, it's really, really tough. Um, one of the tactics I mentioned in the book is just trying to neutrally break the groupthink in a way. Like, well, I don't. It can be more in a neutral way, just to induce a conversation that you present another point of view, or you ask a question in a more neutral way. Like, well, I don't know if it's necessarily true. I'm not exactly so sure that that's true. Um, and that was one of the tactics mentioned by people that I interviewed, was just in a more neutral way to not in a heated way. That's, if you get in heated arguments, it's not gonna be productive necessarily. But if you can, in a more neutral way, in that you're not gonna convert people right away or change people's mind right away. But if you could kind of say, induce a conversation and just share an alternative point of view, and it would get people thinking, an hour later, the next day, um, and kind of break that conformity, in a small way. Um, so that's, yeah, in these heightened times, it's even more critical to kind of be able to do that.
You have lots of really good concrete tactics that workplaces can use to foster independent thinking, which you argue is really important to get these ideas out in the open. Talked about one just now. Asking questions is a good one, because it really forces people to kind of analyze and present their
Uh,
argument of why they thought their position, right? So you talk about that in your book.
mhm,
One thing you talk about in your book, and I would love to hear you tell us more about it, is this idea of the company's advocate. Because I think
mhm.
that's a really practical way we could kind of put in our meetings, in our workplace, that gets to some of that independent thinking, but it's embedded in the structure of our conversations. Tell me about that company's advocate idea.
Sure. Yeah, I think most people are familiar with the sort of devil's advocate notion, and this is sort of a variant of that. And it's at a company called EDSI. It's in outside Detroit, and Kevin Schneider's uh, the CEO there. They have this idea of a company's advocate, which is the EDSI advocate. So rather than saying like, well, just to play the devil's advocate, which is a nice, you sort of take it out on a roll, and you're just saying like, I'm a devil's advocate. But that's um, not necessarily the nicest framing, or being a devil's advocate. But the idea of they have the idea of being the EDSI advocate, or the company advocate. So rather than saying devil's advocate, you might say, just to play the company advocate here, is a role to kind of take it out of your own. Um, you just kind of share a point of view, but you have this intention that it's not just sharing a point of view to be contrarian, but that you have the larger interest of the organization at heart by sharing this divergent viewpoint in a way that could help everybody. Um, and so it can just kind of jar that if you're all moving towards something, you say, well, to play the company advocate here approach, did we think about this? Do we think it's true? What should we test this out first? Should we, um, are we sure that assumption is correct here? So it's a good way to kind of structuring things into roles is very helpful, because you
Yeah.
can, it takes the sort of, again, some of the pain of independence and putting all the onus on one individual. It takes it off you a bit.
And this brings me to my final and perhaps the most important question of this whole conversation, which is, why is independent thinking so important in a workplace? Independent thinking, divergent thinking, that unpopular viewpoint. Why is that so valuable to an organization, to a workplace?
Yeah, I mean, there's the key reasons, obviously, making better decisions, rushing headlong into a decision that proves fairly disastrous down the road. There's also innovative outcomes. You could, I talk a lot about those in terms of new ideas that that could really help you adapt for the long term in an organization. And so being open to those independent, those new viewpoints to a limited extent. You can't always be rethinking and thinking about new innovative ideas, but they're going to help you adapt for the long run. To help you avoid disasters with bad decisions, to help you with new innovative ideas. And there's also just a kind of well-being component too, of like, if everybody, being able, there's the in psychology, the idea of procedural justice, where you just have, like, you don't necessarily agree with perhaps the outcome of a decision, but if you thought the process was fair in coming to that decision, you're okay. You're okay with it, even if it's not the outcome you wanted. That you don't think it was the right decision, but everybody had a fair audience and to share their point of view. It helps people's both job satisfaction, retention, staying with the organization. So that's another key component. So there's making better decisions, innovative outcomes, and just your kind of well-being and satisfaction of working organization where you can share your point of view and it's heard, even if not always going to be acted upon.
In the research that you did and all the interviews that you conducted, you talk about this fear of people losing their job if they speak out.
Mm-hmm.
And so how common was that occurrence, and how concerned are you about that happening in workplaces where in certain situations people have this fear of losing their jobs if they speak out? Did that happen in the interviews that you conducted?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly happens, and it was certainly prevalent. I mean, it all kind of depends on what you're speaking up about and how you do it, and then the extent of the infraction. There's the kind of whistleblower case, which I had sort of a subset of interviews with whistleblowers where that in those cases there is a lot of retaliation against you, and then there's the other more everyday cases, whether it's a new product, new innovative idea. So, but it is a huge concern that kind of weighs on you. And I had different people talk about, they're maybe earlier in their careers, they were more willing to speak up about stuff they know, like, oh, I didn't have a mortgage, I didn't have a family to support. So,
well, there's more time to find another job, right? Build another career, but less so the older you get.
Yeah. So it definitely becomes more and more challenging when you have all those additional considerations. So,
Ryan, thank you so much for your time today.
Sure. My pleasure.